Mindful Self-Compassion. With me today is Amanda Meyer. She is our trauma-sensitive yoga teacher and mindfulness instructor, and she will be doing the second half of our Mindful Self-Compassion awareness session. And our program director, Vera, is on today. She's kind of helping with moderating the room, moderating the chat. And so if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. We will be sending out information like a follow-up email with the PDF of the PowerPoint. And this session is being recorded, and that will be available on our website. Just a few housekeeping things. So about Prevent Suicide today, I think I saw a few of you who registered who might not be in Chatham County or in Savannah or even maybe in Georgia. But Prevent Suicide today, we are a community-based program, and we actually work to prevent suicide by raising awareness about suicide and applying some evidence-based prevention and resiliency building trainings. And so we actually kind of take a doubled approach to this. So on one side, we do suicide prevention trainings, and that's like our suicide talk, our safe talk, and our assist workshops, which stands for Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training. Some of you may have taken that before. It's a 2-day workshop. And these are just evidence-based trainings to help increase our knowledge about suicide and help prevent suicide more, what we call down the stream. But we also realized we needed to equip ourselves and our community more upstream prevention, what we call upstream prevention. And this is with resiliency building skills. And so we kind of, started increasing our own knowledge and skills about mindful self-compassion and began giving this to our community to kind of empower our community with the tools for emotional resilience and well-being. And we will talk a little bit later about some research behind mindful self-compassion and why we use that, or why we have begun using this for suicide prevention. But this is just a little bit of a background about Prevent Suicide today, if you are unfamiliar with us. So we're actually going to begin by doing a poem. We like starting our sessions with poems. If you just joined, could you please mute your microphone if you know how, just to kind of limit some background noise. Thank you. So this is the poem we're going to read today. If you can start the day without caffeine, if you can always be cheerful, ignoring aches and pains, if you can resist complaining and boring people with your troubles, if you can eat the same food every day and be grateful for it, if you can understand when your loved ones are too busy to give you any time, if you can take criticism and blame without resentment, if you can conquer tension without medical help, if you can relax without alcohol, if you can sleep without the aid of drugs, then you are probably a dog. Just kind of a cute, funny poem that we like, beginning our sessions with, kind of just getting us a little bit warmed up. So now talking about mindful self-compassion, the program directly, we kind of like to say that it's a good thing that we at Prevent Suicide today actually didn't create this program. It was created by 2 people who are very smart, a lot smarter than us. And they are Dr. Kristen Neff and Dr. Chris Germer. And so there are other mindful-based programs that are out there. You may have heard of like mindfulness-based stress reduction or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And these also increase self-compassion kind of as a byproduct of mindfulness. But mindful self-compassion was actually created to explicitly teach the general public the skills needed to be self-compassionate in daily life. And so like I said earlier, we really started mindful self-compassion just to kind of help take care of ourselves and help take care of our community while we're doing suicide prevention trainings. And we really believe that our work with mindful self-compassion really aligns with the National Suicide Prevention and Resource Center's best practices. by us hosting workshops that teach mindfulness and self-compassion, we're really trying to create this culture that promotes qualities like empathy and optimism and forgiveness. And so we've adapted some of these teachings in mindful self-compassion into this hour-long awareness training. And I do like to say that it is an hour-long awareness training. We're only really going to be scratching the surface about mindful self-compassion and really just getting a taste about what it is and what self-compassion is. And we do have additional resources if you're more interested in learning or increasing your knowledge about mindful self-compassion beyond just this hour-long awareness session. So our learning objectives for today, we're really kind of hoping that you're going to build an understanding of what mindful self-compassion is. You may have heard of it before, you may not have heard of it before, but really just getting a basic understanding of what it is and its elements. We're going to explore some of the benefits of self-compassion and identify ways that we can implement self-compassion into our life. And then finally, we're going to help you recognize some community resources for mindful self-compassion if you are interested in deepening your knowledge and your skills in this. So before we really begin talking about self-compassion and mindfulness, I do kind of want to bring up some guiding principles for today, just to kind of keep ourselves safe, but challenged. You know, right now is a really difficult time for a lot of us being self-quarantined or being isolated from others with coronavirus going on, or we may know of people who have gotten sick or maybe sick ourselves. And so this is a really challenging time. And sometimes when we start to give ourselves compassion, that can actually bring up a lot of heavy emotions for us. So I'm really encouraging you to really take care of yourself in that moment. If you find that during an exercise or during any part of this training, if you're starting to feel overwhelmed or feeling anxiety, you know, kind of in this overwhelming zone on the very outside bubble, you know, really just kind of taking a step back and really giving yourself space to make yourself feel more safe. And you can do that, you know, by not participating in any exercises if you feel like it may be overwhelming for you, because that is self-compassionate. Feel free to not participate. Or, you know, you can open or close your eyes at any time. We will be doing some brief mindfulness activities. And if you don't feel like closing your eyes, feel free to keep them partially open or even fully open. Or even if you're feeling yourself being activated by something, either what we're talking about or practicing, you can feel free to disengage by even leaving the meeting, or, you know, taking a note about what you need to do later today. So really just trying to keep yourself safe from that overwhelming zone. But we do encourage you to, you know, kind of challenge yourself in this. Not overwhelming yourself, but, you know, kind of feeling a little bit of a strain, you know, kind of practicing the self-compassion while reminding yourself to keep yourself safe. Just to kind of go over some principles that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about self-compassion, because it can be very activating for some of us. So now that we are all here, or most of us are here, I'm actually going to begin the session by doing what we call a soft landing. And this is just a very brief mindfulness exercise to kind of help us bring our hearts and our minds into the room. You know, we're physically present, but maybe we're thinking about other things, or you know, our thoughts are racing. So we're just going to kind of try and bring our minds and our hearts, our emotions into the room. So let's just take a few moments to settle back. And sitting in a comfortable position, but whatever's comfortable for you. Maybe that's putting your feet firmly on the floor. Maybe it's sitting cross-legged or even standing. It's whatever you feel that's supportive. And you can either partially or fully close your eyes. And then take a few deep breaths in through our nose and out through our mouth. And then you can return to your regular breathing, And just simply notice how your body breathes itself. Feeling your chest expand or your belly expand and contract with each of your breath. And if you feel like your mind is starting to wander, starting to think about other things, just gently bring your attention back to your anchor, which is your breath. Now let's turn our attention inward and notice if there's any stress or any tension in our bodies. Maybe you're feeling a little tight in your shoulders, or in your lower back is a little bit tight. And if you're feeling any stress or any tension, just giving yourself a silent and compassionate awe. And if you want, you can put a hand on your heart, or maybe a hand on any part of your body that's maybe experiencing some tension or some stress. And offer yourself a compassionate touch. And you can gently release your hand whenever you're ready. And you can open your eyes. So now I'd like to do a small exercise. We call it the Why Am I Here practice. And you can go ahead and write this down if you want to. If you journal, this may be a good time to get out your journal and really write down what you're thinking. Or you could just, kind of ponder, get some ideas about what's going on. So go ahead and ask yourself this question: why am I here? And really think about your answer for a few moments. And now ask yourself, but why am I really here? Did you find that there was maybe a difference in your answers to the two questions? We do this exercise when we do in-person trainings for our mindful self-compassion awareness sessions. And I'll ask, our participants, maybe did you find when you first asked yourself this question, why am I here? Maybe it was, well, I'm here because of work. Work made me come here, or, I heard about this and it's good for professional development, and that's awesome. Those are really great answers. But then when you think about why am I really here, sometimes there can be a difference to those answers. Sometimes we heard that people were saying, well, why am I really here? Well, I'm actually, I'm really interested in self-compassion because I haven't really been giving myself compassion that frequently. Or maybe I really don't know what this means and I feel like I need to increase my self-care. Or maybe those answers were the same. Maybe why am I here? I want to take care of myself, but why am I really here? Well, I want to take care of myself, and that's awesome. But this, this little practice just kind of helps us peel back a layer and kind of warm up to set our intentions mindfully for the rest of this training. Just a short little exercise for us here. So before we begin talking about self-compassion, I'd like to talk about what is compassion for others, right? What needs to happen in order to feel compassion for others? Or what makes a response compassionate? When we have compassion for somebody else, what makes that response compassionate? And there are a few things that need to happen in order for us to evoke compassion or have a compassionate response. So in order to have compassion for others, we must first notice that they are suffering, right? When we're looking at this picture, we first have to notice that this boy is suffering, that he's crying, that he's upset. And then secondly, in order to have compassion, we need to be moved by this person's suffering so that we respond to their pain. So compassion involves a response to alleviate suffering. So we're noticing that somebody may be in pain. We're having an empathetic response, and then we're taking action to help alleviate that suffering. So having compassion also means that we, offer an understanding and a kindness to others when they fail or make mistakes. This compassionate response, rather than giving them a harsh judgment or criticizing them harshly. So it's noticing and then taking action to alleviate the suffering, but within that, having a care and a kindness to this understanding, to this alleviating the suffering, rather than this harsh judgment. So then what is self-compassion? Well, really, self-compassion is the same thing, but it's directed towards ourselves. So self-compassion involves treating ourselves the way we would treat a friend who is having a hard time. So when you're thinking about this, like, what would you say to this friend? Or maybe what tone would you use? Generally, if we have a friend who is having a hard time, we may offer them some comfort or, say, this is really difficult for you right now. You may be more kind and understanding. So with self-compassion, we're directing that inwards, and we're directing that care and that kindness towards ourselves. So through self-compassion, we become an inner ally instead of an inner enemy. So to kind of think about this a little bit more, you can go ahead and close your eyes and just reflect on this question, or, keep your eyes open and just thinking about this. So think about times when you've maybe had a close friend who was struggling in some way. Maybe they failed or felt inadequate, or they were having a really hard time with something, but you were feeling pretty good about yourself. You were having an okay day or a good day. So how would you typically respond to your friend in that situation? What might you say to them if they came to you with their struggle? What would your posture be like? Or what would your nonverbal gestures be like? How would you approach this situation? And now I want you to reflect on this next scenario. So think about times when you've been struggling in a certain way. Maybe you failed, maybe you felt inadequate, maybe you felt shame for something, felt like you didn't do a good job. So how do you typically respond to yourself in these situations? What is that inner voice to yourself? What type of tone do you use when you're talking to yourself, or your nonverbal gestures? In between these two scenarios, do you notice any difference between how you would treat your friends when they were struggling versus how do you treat yourself? When we do this in person and I ask our participants, like, what did you notice? Did you notice any patterns? A lot of different answers come up. A lot of people say, when in the first scenario, if a friend is struggling, I usually give them kindness, or I'm more understanding, or I offer them some good advice or something. But when I struggle, I usually beat myself up. Like, maybe I'm telling myself, wow, I shouldn't have done that. Or, wow, that was such a bad job. I can't believe you did that. That's so embarrassing. And so, when we do this exercise, a lot of us are shocked at how differently we actually treat ourselves versus our friends. And we actually find that we are more compassionate towards other people versus than with ourselves. And so, we should really begin to try and change this relationship with ourselves through self-compassion, and really treating ourselves with this kindness and this understanding that we would with other people. So when we think about self-compassion, there are actually 3 parts to its definition. And we have at the top circle self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. And you could think of this as like a 3-legged stool, and each component is holding up self-compassion. Each of these three core components are an important part of understanding what self-compassion is and how we can practice self-compassion. And another way to describe this is connected, loving presence. So connected being common humanity, loving being self-kindness, and presence being mindfulness. So when we find ourselves in a state of a loving, connected presence, really our relationship with ourselves and others and really the world is transformed. So we're going to begin looking at this first component, self-kindness versus self-judgment. So self-kindness literally means being kind to ourselves and treating ourselves with this care and understanding rather than this really harsh judgment or harsh self-criticism. And part of self-kindness is acknowledging our shortcomings and accepting that we are flawed because we are human. But instead of attacking ourselves for being this way, for being inadequate or for being flawed, we instead offer ourselves warmth and acceptance. So with self-kindness, we actively soothe and comfort ourselves. So when we respond to ourselves with this goodwill, this care and this understanding, we help generate positive emotions of love and care that can help us cope and build resilience. So our second component that we're going to talk about is common humanity versus isolation. So common humanity is a sense of interconnectedness. It's recognizing that all of us are works in progress, that everyone fails or that everyone makes mistakes from time to time, and that everyone does experience hardships in life. We like to kind of ask this question, how many of us have never felt pain in our lives? And of course, nobody raises their hands. Like everybody has experienced pain at one point or another in their life. And that is the sense of common humanity. So common humanity is the opposite of isolation. So we all suffer, but we all have different flavors of suffering. So the pain that I feel in difficult times is the same pain that you feel in difficult times, but the circumstances may be different. The degree of pain may be different, but generally this basic experience of feeling pain is the same. So when we remember that, this basic experience is part of the human experience, we can actually create a moment of connection with others rather than feeling isolated. And so our third component is mindfulness. So mindfulness involves us being aware of our moment-to-moment experience, so our present experience, in a clear and balanced manner without judgment. So mindfulness really allows us to be with painful feelings as they are, without suppressing these feelings, without over-identifying with these feelings, and without running away from these feelings. So with mindfulness, we can recognize that our thoughts and feelings are just that they're just thoughts and feelings, that they don't encompass all of what we are. So why is mindfulness an important part of self-compassion? Well, this kind of goes back to what compassion is in the first place. Mindfulness is important because we need to be able to turn inward and recognize when we're suffering. So remember, compassion is noticing when somebody's suffering. Well, mindfulness is noticing when we're suffering. We need to be able to notice when we're having a hard time. And then after we notice that we're having a hard time or we're having stress or pain or suffering, this general sense or this general term, suffering, then we can respond to ourselves with care and kindness without over-identifying with our feelings of pain or stress. So mindfulness really invites us to be open to our suffering with a spacious and loving awareness. So when we talk about self-compassion, many of us often think of a more tender side of self-compassion, this care and this comforting. And that's true. There is a tender side to self-compassion, but there are more attributes of self-compassion, and it actually kind of forms a duality like yin and yang. So one is the softer side, the yin side, which is being with ourselves. But we also have the other side, which is more action-oriented, what we call yang. And to cultivate self-compassion within ourselves, it's often useful to ask ourselves this question: what do I need right now? And then maybe, but what do I really need right now? So the yin is self-compassion. So this yin side really means being with ourselves in a compassionate way, by comforting and soothing and validating ourselves. So yin is this tender aspect of self-compassion. We're being with ourselves in a compassionate way. We're comforting our emotional body. We're soothing our physical body, or we're validating our struggle. So soothing your physical body, this could be like getting a massage or maybe taking a bath, really being yourself, soothing yourself, comforting your emotional sense. Maybe that's listening to music or journaling. So it's really just this tender side of self-compassion that we have. But we also have the yang side of self-compassion. So yang takes action to alleviate suffering by protecting, providing, and motivating ourselves. So it is considered the fierce aspect of self-compassion. So we're acting in the world in a compassionate way. Maybe we're protecting ourselves from harm. So maybe right now that means, wearing a face mask or wearing gloves, or maybe staying self-quarantined. We're protecting ourselves from harm. We're providing ourselves for what we need. Maybe that means going out and getting groceries for ourselves, or providing ourselves a healthy meal right now, and then motivating ourselves. So yang takes action to alleviate suffering. So when we ask ourselves this question, what do I need right now? We're actually giving ourselves a moment to find what side of self-compassion we can respond to ourselves with. Even if we don't have an answer, or if we don't have the ability to meet our needs at that time, still by asking this question, what do I need right now? You're still giving yourself a moment of self-compassion. You're kind of being mindful that you need to act. So sometimes we can give ourselves compassion more formally, like through a meditation or a formal practice. But we can also practice self-compassion informally, like in our day-to-day lives. So the mindful self-compassion does have 7 formal meditations to kind of cultivate self-compassion, and 20 informal practices. We're just getting a taste right now of what self-compassion is, but we can kind of give ourselves compassion more informally as well, not just formally. So this informal practice really can be like a self-care in our daily lives. Maybe that means just giving ourselves a soothing touch, like putting our hand on our chest. Maybe that's a soothing touch for us. Like I mentioned earlier, maybe that means giving yourself a healthy meal. Or washing your hands, or listening to music or journaling or something like that. So that can be an informal method of practicing self-compassion. So another way to remember this, we have this acronym PARC, and it's pause, ask, read, and kindly respond. And so maybe just taking a moment to pause and then ask yourself this question, what do I need right now? And then maybe read your physical body or read your emotional body, and then kindly respond. And that kind of helps us remember how to go about asking this question. You can also think about it, kind of the duality of self-compassion for PARC. So PARC, maybe that means going for a walk in the park. We're taking action to alleviate suffering. Maybe that yang side, this action-oriented side. Or maybe PARC, like sitting and parking ourselves. So maybe this yin side of self-compassion, the soothing side, maybe I just need a moment for myself right now. And so this PARC model can help us kind of see the duality of self-compassion and help us answer, what do I need right now? Kind of help us remember that. So now we're going to practice some gestures that represent the yin and the yang attributes of self-compassion. And if you can see me, then you can go ahead and copy these gestures. If you're on the phone, I'm going to try to explain them. And this is just kind of to help us put into practice what I was just talking about. So if we clench our fists like this, we're making fists with our hands. And they're really, really tight. And let's say that we were holding this for a long time, just like clenched fists. So what does this feel like? Or what would this feel like? Well, it's a lot of tension, right? And this can actually hurt. Like your nails may be digging into your palms. Maybe your shoulders are starting to tense up. Maybe our bodies are starting to tense up. You know, we kind of feel on edge. So this is actually what self-criticism feels like. You know, we're giving ourselves tension. We're kind of fighting ourselves. So maybe opening our hands, kind of like in a prayer form or a praise form. So this is an attribute of maybe mindfulness, kind of openness, of presence. And then maybe putting our arms out, kind of like a ball, a circle, like a hula hoop. And we like to ask, well, what does this feel like when our arms are out like this in the circle? You know, common responses, you know, it feels like we're giving a hug, you know, or we're feeling connected, right? So this kind of tree hug is a sense of common humanity. We're feeling connected with each other. And then maybe crossing your hand, putting one hand on top of another, and then placing them on your heart. Just like this. And maybe you're stroking your chest a little bit. This cross palm, well, what does this feel like for most of us? Well, this feels, you know, soothing, or it feels kind. You know, and if we were all in a room together, if we could all see each other, you know, if we're all looking at each other with our hands on our hearts like this, well, that's not, you know, it looks very soothing. Like nobody looks like they're about to lunge at you or to attack you, right? Like it's very comforting to see this. And sometimes we actually find ourselves rocking when we place our hands like this. And so another one to picture is kind of like a boxing pose. So you're standing up and your feet are firmly on the floor, maybe shoulder width apart, and your hands are, you know, waist high. You're kind of getting ready. You feel sturdy and you feel firm on the floor, right? Maybe it feels motivating, like you're about to do something, right? Or maybe just placing your hand out like this, your hand in front of you, like talk to the hand, right? No. So maybe we're protecting ourselves in this moment. You know, maybe we're creating our boundaries. We're taking action to alleviate suffering. We're saying no. And then finally, you know, placing our hands in front of us and like moving them outwards like this. Maybe we are giving and receiving compassion. Maybe we're providing, we're giving, but we're also receiving because we're bringing it around, right? So these are just some gestures that kind of help us, you know, physically understand some of the attributes of self-compassion and some of the components of self-compassion. Just a brief little exercise. So there are physiological differences between self-criticism and self-compassion in how we respond to perceived danger. So both self-criticism and self-compassion trigger brain structures that release chemicals. But self-criticism is different than self-compassion in many ways. And so we're going to kind of dig in just a little bit into the science behind self-compassion and self-criticism. So we're going to begin with self-criticism. So self-criticism involves what is called the threat defense system. And this is commonly known as fight, flight, or freeze, which are common trauma responses. So when we perceive a threat, our brain actually releases cortisol and adrenaline, and we get ready to fight, flee, or freeze. It's activating this threat defense system. And so this system does work well for protecting threats to our physical bodies. However, most of the threats that we face nowadays are actually just challenges to our self-image, to our self-concept. So this threat defense system and this response actually puts us at a state of constant stress. And, you know, constant or chronic or constant stress can cause anxiety and depression. You know, we hear chronic stress can actually cause physical health problems. And this is really why really harsh self-criticism is so bad for our well-being. Because with this harsh criticism, we actually become both the attacker and the attacked. So in this table that we see, we're actually seeing the stress response, this fight, flight, or freeze, and what this response looks like when it's activated, or what the stress response looks like when it's turned inward. So we have our stress response fight, and that stress response turned inward is self-criticizing. And then precisely the opposite of that is self-compassion, the three components of self-compassion. So self-kindness, right? And then we have the stress response flight. And that stress response turned inward, maybe we are isolating ourselves. And then, you know, that component of self-compassion, that is the opposite of that, is common humanity, the sense of interconnectedness. And then finally, we have freeze. And the stress response turned inward could be rumination. You know, maybe we're thinking about something over and over and over and over again. And then the component of self-compassion, that is the opposite of that, is mindfulness. You know, being aware of our present experience without over-identifying with our feelings. And so these three reactions are the opposite of the three core components of self-compassion, you know, self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So now we're going to look at the science of self-compassion. So we also have what is called the mammalian caregiving system. And so when this system is activated, hormones like oxytocin and natural endorphins are released, which helps reduce stress and increase our feelings of safety and security. And so compassion and self-compassion are both linked to this mammalian caregiving system. And self-compassion helps us to downregulate this threat defense system, or this threat response. And really, this mammalian caregiving system was, you know, it's an evolutionary advantage. So we take care of our young, you know, cats take care of their kittens, puppies take care, or dogs take care of their puppies, you know. It helps us connect with others and really help us calm ourselves down. So when we practice self-compassion, we are deactivating our threat defense system, and we are activating our care system. So we are decreasing our cortisol levels, and we are increasing our feelings of safety and security when we practice self-compassion. So there are two reliable ways of actually activating this caregiving system. And these are a soothing and supportive touch, or a supportive and gentle touch, and soothing vocalization. And so I encourage you, this is another exercise if you feel like you want to participate. We're going to try and figure out what kind of gentle and supportive touch feels right for us to kind of help us activate this caregiving system. And I do want to note that some of these may feel good to you. These may feel soothing and caring for you, but for other people, this may not feel caring or soothing for you. So it's really just finding what supportive touch feels comfortable for you and supportive for you. So our first one that we're going to do is maybe just placing one hand on our hearts like this. Or maybe it's placing our other hand over our first hand on our heart. And this, again, may be supportive for some of us, and maybe, this may not feel comfortable for some of us, and that's okay. So maybe stroking our chest gently, or maybe we need to feel some more strength, or a little bit stronger self-compassion in this moment. So maybe making a fist with one of our hands and then placing our open hand over our fist on our heart, just like this. Or maybe placing one hand on our hearts and one hand on our belly. Or placing both of our hands on our belly. And I actually really like the two hands on the belly for me personally. I find myself and a lot of people actually experience a lot of anxiety in their stomachs, or a lot of stress in their stomach. Your stomach can feel kind of tight, or like you're feeling nauseous. And so by placing both of your hands on your stomach, you're validating that feeling. You're giving yourself an actual touch of compassion and saying, yes, I can feel that I'm nervous right now, or that, I'm having some anxiety in my stomach. And this is really caring for me, and I'm giving myself some compassion. So I really like this hands on the stomach. But maybe this, might not work for you. So maybe placing one hand on your cheek, or cradling your cheeks like this. Or it could be just simply stroking your arms, or giving yourself a hug. Or it could just be simply placing one hand on top of the other and placing it in your lap. And it's really just finding what gesture works for you. We did this exercise, or this training, with some youth. And one of the youth described that, his gentle and supportive touch was actually just like placing his hands together, his two fingers, and just rubbing them gently. And that was soothing and supportive for him. And we might actually find that we're already doing this. How many of us have had a sore shoulder before, and, we've been rubbing our shoulders, giving ourselves compassion in that moment, or, maybe placing both of your hands on your lower back. Maybe you're feeling some tightness right there, giving compassion to that part of your body. And so for soothing vocalization, we kind of incorporate our touch with this vocalization. And so you can think of it, maybe it was placing your hand on your heart and then just giving yourself a sigh, like, or maybe even vocalizing what you're feeling, like, this is really hard for me right now. Or I am really stressed out. I am struggling. It's just giving yourself some validation, some soothing vocalization. And you can also kind of think of it like people who practice yoga often have some sort of vocalization. Maybe they go or they hum. And that kind of helps promote this compassionate or relaxation response. That's what we're trying to do here. So in this next practice that we have, Amanda's actually going to take over, and we are going to be using this compassionate touch in this exercise.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. Appreciate that. So we are going to do our practice, and this is called our self-compassion break. And so this practice is a way to help remind ourselves to apply the three core components of self-compassion that Hannah has been talking about and sharing. And again, the mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness. And so this is a practice with those three core components that we can do when difficulties arise for us in our lives. So it also harnesses the power of the soothing touch, as Hannah was discussing. So we can combine all of those components together in this practice. So for this practice, I invite you to just sit comfortably. If you're sitting already, maybe you need to kind of adjust or move your body just a little bit to give yourself a little bit of a moving break here. And just find a space where you can sit and really connect with your chair, wherever you are in the space of the room that you're in. And I invite you to sit with your eyes either closed, maybe they're partly closed, maybe your eyes are open and you have a soft gaze on something in front of you. And I ask you to think of a situation in your life that is causing you stress. Maybe it's a health problem, a relationship problem, a work problem, or some other struggle. And in thinking of this situation, I ask you to choose a problem in kind of the mild to moderate range. So not a big problem. We want to practice and build resources for self-compassion gradually. So we'll focus on something, like I said, in the mild to moderate range. And we're going to visualize the situation clearly in our mind's eye. So I want you to imagine what is the setting for this problem, who is involved, maybe who is saying what to whom, what is happening, what might happen, and really bring yourself into that moment. And I ask you, in experiencing and visualizing this situation in your life, can you feel the discomfort in your body as you bring this difficulty to mind? And if you can't, maybe try a slightly more difficult problem, something that really evokes a physical response. And now, as you're visualizing and really being in this situation, try saying to yourself, this is a moment of suffering. Just labeling it, identifying, I'm suffering. And that is mindfulness. And if this is a moment of suffering, perhaps doesn't work for you, some other wording might speak to you better. Some options are, this hurts. Ouch. This is really stressful. And now try saying to yourself, suffering is a part of life. That phrase, that is the common humanity piece. Some other options of wording might be, I'm not alone. Everyone experiences this. Everyone experiences suffering, just like I am suffering right now. Another phrase might be, this is how it feels when people struggle this way. For me, I have often, in using this practice, have thought like, oh, this is what being hurt feels like. This is how it feels when people feel sad, by labeling it and giving it that wording. And now offer yourself the gesture of a soothing touch that you discovered in our previous exercise. And try saying to yourself, while offering yourself that soothing touch, may I be kind to myself. May I give myself what I need. Right? That practice of asking ourselves, what do I need? And what do I really need? And then giving ourselves that, what do we need? And perhaps there are particular words of kindness and support that you need to hear right now in this situation. And sometimes, for me, I know personally, I often, and in the past, have looked for an external voice to offer words of kindness and support. And we do need those, maybe a friend or a loved one. But for me, learning that I can actually give myself that support is very helpful. So maybe some options would be, may I accept myself as I am. May I begin to accept myself as I am. May I forgive myself. May I be strong. May I be patient. And if you're having difficulty finding the right words, imagine that a dear friend or loved one is having the same problem as you. And imagine that conversation. What would you say to this person? What simple message would you like to deliver to your friend, heart to heart? And see if you can offer the same message to yourself. Take a second to notice really how you're feeling after this practice and this experience. And when you feel ready and comfortable, you can open your eyes and just take a moment to observe and reflect on what you experienced. So moving on to our next slide, we're going to just briefly talk about the explosion of research in the past decade that has been done looking into mindful self-compassion. And so there are over 1,000 articles in mindful self-compassion, and there are areas of study that produce research on self-compassion that range across the board. Especially for those that are listening that maybe have a specific area that you're working in. Maybe you work with trauma, maybe you have some intervention training, maybe you work with adolescents or aging population. And the really amazing thing is that mindful self-compassion has been researched in all of these different areas. Maybe you work with the military or PTSD or have all these different components that have been researched that show that it actually does help and it aids in supporting those individuals going through those different areas. So it's a pretty exciting area to be in because of all the research that has been done. And so self-compassion leads to well-being. And it does this by holding negative thoughts and emotions in that loving, connected presence, like we mentioned before. And it does this with self-compassion. It shows that there are reductions in negative mind states like anxiety, depression, stress, rumination, thought suppression, perfectionism, and shame. And it actually have found that self-compassion is linked to increase in positive mind states like satisfaction, happiness, connectedness, self-confidence, optimism, curiosity, and gratitude. So in those studies, it has been shown that self-compassion actually leads to all of these really positive increase and also the reductions in those negative mind states. There is also a really great tool that all of you, if you're interested, can utilize. And this is a self-compassion scale. And so it's a test of how more of a, not a test necessarily, but more of a tool or resource just to assess how self-compassionate am I, and especially if mindfulness is something that's maybe new to you, or if you've been practicing mindfulness for a while. It's a great way to just check in and just see and acknowledge how self-compassionate am I really. And so Kristen Neff has a scale that you can actually take on her website, and there's a resource, and we can definitely send that out after this course is over with, where you're actually able to take a self-compassionate test and answer several different questions. It goes on a scale, so it goes from almost never to almost always. And a couple of the examples of questions for those of you that maybe can't see the screen are, I try to be understanding and patient towards those aspects of my personality that I don't like. And so you would actually be able to give yourself a rating, a number from 1 to 5. So almost never to almost always. And once you've gone through the scale, you're given your results, and you can see, do I have a more low self-compassion, or do you have a moderate, or do I have a high? And as you practice self-compassion, this can be a really good tool to kind of like just give yourself an acknowledgement of where you're at. Especially at the beginning, I think it's a great tool as far as to show how much growth that you could maybe have, instead of looking at it as this negative of, oh, I don't have a lot of self-compassion. Wow, my score was really low. For me, when I took it, it was such a great tool because I was like, wow, well, great. I have so much to learn and I have a lot of room to grow to become more self-compassionate. So that's a really great tool and reference that, again, like I mentioned, Kristen Neff has on her website that you can take. And so from there, we're actually going to transition into talking about 5 misgivings about self-compassion. So when people think of self-compassion, there are often misconceptions or misgivings about what self-compassion is or how it affects us. And so we'll explore 5 of the common misgivings about self-compassion. And the first misgiving is that self-compassion is actually a form of self-pity. And so many people fear that self-compassion is actually just a form of self-pity. But while self-pity says, poor me, self-compassion actually recognizes that life is hard for everyone. So research shows that self-compassionate people are more likely to engage in perspective taking rather than focusing on their own distress. So when we are self-compassionate, we remember that everyone suffers from time to time, right? That common humanity piece. And it doesn't allow us to exaggerate on the extent of our struggles. And so that's that mindfulness component of really being aware of what's going on without the over-exaggeration of what our experience actually is. And so self-compassion really is not a woe is me attitude. And so our next misgiving is that it means weakness. And so self-compassion, if you're self-compassionate, it means that you are weak. A big fear is that self-compassion will either make us weak or shows that we are weak or that we're vulnerable. And research actually shows that people who use self-compassion are better at coping with life struggles. So whether it's divorce or chronic health conditions, self-compassion is this tool that is a coping mechanism that can help us. It's also a protective factor. And so it can help protect against post-traumatic stress disorder, for instance, after some type of combat or trauma that people have experienced. And our third misgiving is that self-compassion will undermine motivation. And so self-compassion is actually linked to more personal responsibility and motivation to repair mistakes. So it provides a safety needed to admit mistakes rather than feeling the need to blame someone else. And so really being able to use self-compassion as a tool for acknowledging, okay, I made this mistake. But I can take ownership from that and I can comfort myself maybe in my feeling of failure, and I can move forward more positively. So most people believe self-criticism is an effective motivator, but it's actually not. Self-criticism tends to undermine our self-confidence and leads us to fear of failure and really builds upon this negative self-image. But if we are self-compassionate, we will still be motivated to reach our goals, not because we are inadequate as we are, but because we care about ourselves and we want to reach our full potential. Our fourth misgiving is that self-compassion leads to self-indulgence. And although many people fear that being self-compassionate means being self-indulgent, it's actually just the opposite. So compassion inclines us towards long-term health and well-being, not short-term pleasure. And however, the care from compassion provides a motivating force for growth and for change. So self-compassionate people actually engage in healthier behaviors. It's been found, and like exercise, eating well, drinking less, going to the doctor more regularly. And so And actually, that self-compassion piece brings us away from more self-indulgent behavior. And our fifth and final misgiving is that self-compassion is selfish. So some people worry that being self-compassionate rather than focusing on being compassionate to others, they will become self-centered or selfish. I know for me personally, it's always growing up and about, oh, you need to give to others. If you think about yourself, that's really selfish. But in this practice of mindful self-compassion, I've really learned that to be compassionate first to myself and to nurture and care for myself and that relationship I have with myself, that has led me to be so much more present and aware of how to be then compassionate to others. And I'm more prepared. I'm protecting myself and nurturing myself. And so I actually am more readily available to give compassion to others. So self-compassionate people tend to be more caring and supportive in their relationships, and they're more likely to compromise and work through conflict in relationships, and more compassionate and forgiving towards others. And so self-compassion is different than self-esteem. Those two oftentimes can sometimes be confused. So the self-compassion versus self-esteem. And although they may seem very similar, like being linked in to psychological well-being, they're actually different in very significant ways. So self-compassion offers the same well-being benefits without the pitfalls that self-esteem brings. So with self-compassion, there is less emphasis on a social comparison, a self-worth. And so looking at self-esteem, it's often like, well, I have more self-esteem than this person. Or if I do this, I can have more self-esteem. If I achieve, then I can. But with self-compassion, you don't have that comparison. The well-being benefits come with just the practice. And so self-compassion is actually linked to more others-focused concerns without being that narcissistic, more individual, like just focused on me for the self-esteem component. And one of our last slides that we'll talk about is why are some people more self-compassionate than others? And so early influences in an individual's life can have a big impact on whether or not someone will be more self-compassionate. And so things that can be early influencers on people having less self-compassion can include attachment behavior and anxiety, parental criticism, family conflict, history of child abuse, of some type of trauma. And so often with those experiences in people's life, we talk about a window of tolerance. And a window of tolerance describes kind of the zone of arousal in which a person is able to function most effectively. And for those that have experienced those maybe early influences of trauma, of attachment behavior, and maybe parental criticism or conflict, that window of tolerance is very small. But with mindful self-compassion and that practice, that window can actually be wider. And so giving people more of that space and time to react and to be more self-compassionate to themselves with that practice. And so with that slide, can self-compassion be taught? If people have that small amount of self-compassion or don't have self-compassion, worry like, oh no, will I never be able to learn this? And it can be taught. Yes, we are here today to prove that yes, it can be taught. And so with that, we have a couple different ways of practicing and learning mindful self-compassion in our program. So we have an 8-week mindful self-compassion course. So there are, as well as what we provide, the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion offers trainings as well. So there's an 8-week mindful self-compassion course. designed to teach self-compassion skills and develop a practice. There's the one-day mindful self-compassion workshop, which is designed to teach the core mindful self-compassion skills and concepts that we provide. And then what you are participating in now, the 90-minute mindful self-compassion awareness session, which is really designed to discuss and promote self-compassion, to really give you a taste and to do a few of the practices like we did today. There's also additional resources if you are really interested in pursuing this more, or something has sparked your attention today. The Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, their website is a really great wealth of knowledge as far as a place to jump off from and explore maybe that 8-week training. Kristen Neff and Chris Germer both have websites that are very influential and beneficial to learning more information, as well as they have many different YouTube videos with their own mindfulness practices, even TED Talks that explain even more, going into the research and the history for both of them of why they created this training. And there's a mindful self-compassion workbook if you are interested in really kind of doing it with yourself. This book offers many different prompts and helps you engage in different activities that can really help start that mindful self-compassion work. And of course, you can always contact us, assist@chlink.org. We'd be happy to engage and answer any questions or offer more resources.
Thank you, Amanda. Vera, is there anything that you want to say or add before we close out?
Thank you, ladies, for facilitating this workshop, and thank you for all the attendees for being here, and y'all did a great job. Thank you.
Okay, if anybody has any questions, you can type them in the chat or unmute yourself, or you can send us an email. I'll wait a few moments. Thank you. Okay, so our first question is, I am confused on common humanity. Okay, so common humanity, just to explain it again, and I'll explain it and then maybe Vera can explain it, and maybe she has a different definition that may be more easier to understand. So common humanity is one of the core components of self-compassion, and it means that all of us are interconnected through a common human experience. So for instance, I feel stress, and that is common with other people. Other people feel stress. So that common element of feeling stress is the same, but the circumstances may be different. And so really what common humanity is just reminding ourselves that we are all part of a human connectedness. So we don't feel isolated and feeling like I'm the only one feeling stressed right now. You know, maybe I'm the only one having difficulties at work. I'm so stressed out about this. Common humanity kind of helps us remember, you know, other people have likely felt stressed at work before. You know, how can I care for myself in this moment? Vera, if you want to add anything to that.
Yes, thank you, Hannah, for explaining. I think that's great. And just a little something to add, that the element of common humanity actually also helps us to distinguish self-compassion from mere self-acceptance and self-love. So while with self-acceptance, for instance, and self-love, while they're important, they're incomplete by themselves because they leave out a very important element, other people, right? So compassion in itself, by definition, is relational. And what it implies is that basic mutuality in the experience of suffering, and it springs from the acknowledgement that the human experience is imperfect, right? So again, with common humanity, we may just say it's only human. when to console ourselves when we make a mistake, or when we try to comfort someone else who makes a mistake. So self-compassion honors the fact that all human beings are fallible. We all have our faults, and that taking wrong turns isn't just a part of life. So hopefully that's clear on that front. Thank you. Okay. We just received a comment from the participant who asked the question that was, I think, a good clarification.
So we have another question about attachment behavior. I think that was in the slide about how self-compassionate we are, how we grow up. So attachment behavior is more psychology term, or it's a psychological term. It's how we attach to our caregivers. And that can be through a secure attachment, through an insecure attachment, an anxious attachment. And so, we can, or our self-compassionate levels are actually influenced by how our attachments were to our caregivers, and how our caregivers responded to us. Yeah, we're going to provide, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to add just a little something here. What I like to think about as far as it comes to attachment and self-compassion, self-compassion is a process of reparenting ourselves. And what that means is really becoming perhaps your own caregiver and providing yourself the quality of caregiving that you haven't received as a child. To me, that was a very powerful exploration and finding personally. And something that I practice quite often when I experience some sort of distress or emotional difficulty, or especially when I experience acute self-judgment. I imagine myself as a child, or actually I have a picture of myself as a child, one particular picture where I incline toward myself, toward my inner child, with compassion, kindness, and love. And sometimes I actually imagine myself embracing that little girl and being my own parent in some way, being my own advocate and supporter. So I think that may be a valuable component for you all to consider as well. Is that helpful for whoever asked the question? Right. Well, hopefully. All right. Thank you. Anything else? Okay, Hannah, I'm good here.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your week.